Tahir and I have with us Nancy Levine. She is the director of the National Institute for Justice, which NIJ is the Department of Justice's research arm, its evaluation arm. Nancy has a master's degree from the LBJ School in Austin, where I'm headed tonight, and a PhD from Rutgers Newark. She has worked in policing evaluation pretty much all of her career. She headed up the Council of Criminal Justice's task force on policing. She actually started her career at NIJ right at the beginning of your career, I think, right? She spent many years at the Urban Institute running their policing work. And we have brought her here under, I hope, truthful pretenses to talk about the importance of evaluation in the work that you all do. And I think Tahir is going to kick us off. Do you have a mic, Nancy? Yeah, you do.
Yeah, so this feels like a really good time to be having this conversation because the NIJ has a solicitation out right now on alternatives to policing, or the shifting and sharing of police functions. And so I just wanted to ask, like, why these evaluations right now, and why is it so important that we be doing these evaluations?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying it's actually a policing solicitation that has one section on this topic, which makes me sad. Originally, I wanted to have a whole solicitation dedicated to this, but the dollars get spread across a lot of different topics. I also want to add an item to my CV that you didn't mention, but one that's particularly relevant for this topic and this audience, which is that I served as a senior advisor on the Transform 911 initiative between Irvin and joining NIJ, where I worked with Dr. Rebecca Newstetter and a whole team of people. Many of you are in the room, and I only met you by Zoom. I learned so much about all facets of this topic, and my job was to dig into the existing research and assess what we know and what we need to know. And perhaps not surprisingly, there was much more about what we didn't know than what we do. That really inspired me to make sure that this is part of the policing solicitation. This is a moment in time where people are thinking seriously about redefining the role of the police and what activities might be better suited for other people to serve. And I don't want to be that person who says, well, we need more research, because researchers always do that, and it's so irritating. And so I want to be careful to say, we can't wait until the research. We've got to innovate, and those innovations are happening, and we see them. There are examples we're hearing about at this convening that are just so inspiring. But as we innovate, we absolutely have to measure, and we cannot assume. We cannot assume that these things are working because they feel good. And particularly, there's a lot that we have to do to measure potential unintended consequences.
Yeah, one of the things that our faculty director, Christy Lopez, often says is that we didn't wait for a randomized control trial to start mass incarceration. So we don't need one to start to stop it, which, I always feel like is important in these moments.
So let's talk for a minute about how we're going to do it. And Tahir broke the glass, but I want to talk about it a little bit. So we often hear that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. And first tell us why they're the gold standard, and then let's talk about why they may or may not work here and what we're going to do. Want to say a word about just RCTs generally?
Well, RCTs are the gold standard because you control for internal validity issues by ensuring that the random assignment. You really want me to do this?
Okay, no, forget it. Stop.
Here's the thing. Yes, technically, RCTs are the gold standard because they control for a lot of intervening variables because of the random assignment. Okay. However, there are so many questions that cannot be answered with RCTs. And even questions that are answered with RCTs, I have witnessed and I've been a party to RCTs that fall apart in the field. Why is that? Because this isn't a lab. We aren't a bunch of scientists with test tubes. We're talking about people. We're talking about programs. And I think one of the issues I have with RCTs, even though we will, I'm sure, continue to fund some at NIJ under my watch, is that people focus on the methodology to discern impact, but don't spend enough time looking at how the thing they're studying is implemented, the quality, the details, what went well, what went wrong, what needs to be improved. And in my assessment, that's more important. Like I would put that as the platinum standard of research, is really better understanding how we're implementing these things, what's working, what isn't. And again, the unintended consequences. We talk a lot about issues of equity and racial equity in this context, and everyone's looking to alternative responses as the solution to create more equitable outcomes. Well, how the heck do we know whether those outcomes will also not be inequitable? I mean, odds are they will be if we're not careful and we're not really measuring those implementation issues and the impacts.
So you might have just answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway and see if there's more to fill in, which is I wanted to say, okay, so if we're not going to do RCTs, what are we going to do and what is it we're trying to figure out? Do you have thoughts about that? Everything you just said.
There's so many questions that need to be answered in this space. And I missed yesterday's convening because I was at a convening on community engagement, ironically. And I really wanted to hear that afternoon panel with Dr. Galuli and a lot of other experts, because I know that they've been really digging into the data. And we can't think about research and evaluation without thinking about the data, because that's how we're measuring things. And yet there's so much about the data that has baked in biases. They're really hard to disentangle. So I think it's important that we start at a foundational level to interrogate that data. One of my priorities as NIJ director is to promote more inclusive research, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that. And a related priority is that we focus research through a racial equity lens. So, because we have this sense as researchers, as scientists, that, well, because we were trained, we have PhDs, we were taught in methodologies, that those methodologies are correct, and they can be misapplied in ways that can draw conclusions that are just plain wrong, throwing a race variable into a regression analysis and saying, oh, look, that's about race. And it's like, yeah, what about all the things you're not measuring that are around structural inequality and lack of access to opportunity and institutional biases and outright racism? I mean, there's all these things we're not measuring that we need to measure. And then there's issues around the biases that are baked into the data that we're using. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've seen recidivism analyses that use arrest as the measure. And I'm like, no, that's not working for me, because we know where arrests come from.
So you started to talk about this, and so I might push you a little bit further down this ramp. In your solicitation, NIJ talks about special consideration to proposals with methods that include meaningful engagement with the people with lived experience of the subject of study. I whenever I see this, I actually think about my time in law school and immediately after law school, where we had this. We talk about movement lawyering, and we talk about sort of recognizing that for much too long, bunch of smart people with degrees have sat in a room and come up with ideas just amongst themselves without talking to anybody that are actually going to be kind of affected by these ideas, and then going and putting those things into place. And I've gotten the sense, not having a PhD, that there's a similar sort of dynamic that has happened in terms of research design in the past. A bunch of people coming up with ideas, never actually talking to the people who their studies will actually end up hitting. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about, where this sort of approach, this sort of addition comes from, what it is that you're trying to solve.
Sure. That was the inclusive research priority that I mentioned earlier. So Thank you for raising it. And that is baked into all of our solicitations such that we will prioritize proposals that are authentically engaging with the people who are closest to the issue or problem under study. I mean, this should not be revolutionary, but in the context of how PhDs are trained, and I was trained some 3 decades ago. It's like researchers need to keep an arm's length from their research subjects, and even people who were doing community-based research, it was more research on communities, not with communities. And we're starting to evolve as a field, but I think a lot of the training is still quite traditional. So this is my way of kind of prodding the field to be more intentional about building in these perspectives throughout the research process. And importantly, I'm not talking about box checking here. And so we're a little careful about that. There's another part of the solicitation that you might have a question for me on, where we are prioritizing research where there's a meaningful partnership with, it's a weird term they use. I will call it they, even though I'm part of DOJ, but they came up with it before I got there. Culturally specific organizations. Yeah. But essentially, I guess that's like generic term for, depending on the topic, it's going to be a different organization or entity. So for example, we solicit research in tribal communities. So that's going to be a different culturally specific organization than, for example, doing research on alternative responders, where, I imagine that would be going to the communities that are most, generate the highest 911 calls, also the most police response for issues like mental health crises, although that's a whole thing we can unpack because we don't really know.
Lots of crises.
Yeah, and what, like, who's coding it and how. Right. But to go there and really not like ask who the community leaders are, but authentically find some collection of people, recognizing that the community is not a monolith, but still trying to be intentional about that.
And when you think about what this looks like, I appreciate that you noted not just box checking, right? Because I feel like in past decades that's been kind of a way to we want a proxy for equity rather than the actual sort of work that goes into that. So what should researchers be thinking about in terms of how to develop these genuine sort of relationships, to build genuine partnerships even with either some of these community organizations or even with the people that they are working with in the study?
Yeah, I mean, inclusive research has a lot of different components to it, and I'm careful to use the term inclusive research rather than community-based participatory research, which I would say is on one extreme of the continuum, the most robust extreme. And we're supportive of proposals to that involve community-based participatory research methodology. And that's where, like, you barely even come up with the research question without engaging as equal partners the community. So, like, we think you have an issue with policing. What do you think your issue with policing is? And how do you think we should go about better understanding this? And then co-developing the survey questions and collecting the data together and making sure that data is democratized. So you're bringing the data back and you're interpreting it in partnership and you're developing solutions, the implications of the findings in partnership, and then, the research side of the shop, and then tend to be in academic institutions or, research institutes, they by definition have a fair amount of privilege, and, they need to recognize that privilege and use it to uplift those findings, right? So that's one end of the continuum, but I didn't want to let all the other types of researchers off the hook about thinking inclusively about their research designs. And so, even if we're I feel like I need both hands. So I like to do this, show the continuum. On the other side of the continuum, you've got, largely quantitative studies. Does that mean that this can't be inclusive in nature? No, it absolutely should be. How are you getting the data? You're getting it from some source. How are you extracting it? Are you being mindful of compensating people for their time? If your research is quantitative because you've collected data through some kind of systematic survey. Researchers are trained to pilot their survey instruments, but can we go a little bit further and maybe like do focus groups and say, you know, is this the language that resonates with you? What questions are missing to kind of get at this topic that we're trying to learn from? And bringing the findings back, you know, even if it's not an equal partnership in a kind of community-based participatory research model, you can still and should bring those findings back, because researchers traditionally feel like they own the data. Well, I collected it, I own it. And it's like, no, because you collected it from people and you're relying on their expertise and their lived experience. So you bring it back and you help empower them with that data. Like there's ways that they can use that data for their own purposes. And you make sure that when you're bringing the information back, it's in an accessible format. So it's like, oh, here's my technical report. I told you I was going to give it back to you, right? So here it is. I did my job.
It's
Box
in a
check,
CSV file.
right?
Yeah.
And importantly, what are the implications for the findings? Like, how might things be different? What suggestions do they have based on their expertise? You know, I often say, researchers, we're an arrogant bunch, let's face it. How many researchers admit it? You're an arrogant bunch. Thank you, Dr. Newson. Or at least one of you will admit it. We are, as a collective. We worked hard for those letters after our name. We had a lot of training. We had to do a dissertation. We had to defend it. So we are experts.
As a lawyer, I don't know anything about this.
Yeah. The whole bar exam thing. Yeah, I know. Okay, but we're experts on the methodologies that we learned. We're not experts on the top. We may learn more about topics because we dive deep into specific areas, but the true experts are the people who are living and experiencing them.
I wanted to follow up because this has been a remarkable room in the sense that kind of everybody's here. I'm sure not everybody, but we have first responders, we have municipal officials and jurisdictional officials who are setting up these systems. We have researchers, we have funders, we have organizations that are trying to promote the work. And, you know, as you pointed out, the federal dollars only stretch so far. We have people from all over the country doing this work in jurisdictions of all different sizes. And we're all eager to learn. But learning takes a lot of money. In fact, one of the things I learned first, I think, when we started the policing project was that funders were very eager to have evaluation, but much less eager to pay for it. And so do you have any ideas for how jurisdictions can most efficiently start to learn something from the minute they go? I think one thing you're going to say is academic partners, but even those are hard, I think, for sometimes the jurisdictions to find, so that they can, you know, so that we can be making progress on evaluation all the time from the get-go, even if we don't have all the resources to set up a really complicated study. Like, what would you just tell people to do to dig in on this?
But I guess it depends on the topic, right? So, you know, in the policing context, I'd like to see law enforcement agencies be learning agencies, right? So that they're measuring everything as they're implementing different alternatives to the way they do business. And some agencies are better equipped to do that than others. And yes, sometimes it's a research partnership that is needed. But, you know, at a bare minimum, are we even collecting the right data to assess, you know, what we're doing, whether we're doing it as intended, and what the impacts are? And I don't have any solution to that, because I think it's a tough one, but I'd like people, because what I see is there's a lot of innovation and people get very enthusiastic about alternative ways of doing things. And often these models emerge as best practice, air quotes, because they have inspirational leaders who talk about them and everyone's like, it creates buzz, right? And if we don't really know whether and how they're working, and again, what the unintended consequences are, that's actually not good for the field. It's inspiring, but it's not going to really get us where we want to be.
Yeah, I just, you know, one of the things I've learned throughout the last 36 hours or however long we've been doing this is we kind of have every model from alternative response that's within a policing agency to alternative response that's within fire, alternative response that's been set up by the city somewhere else in city government, alternative response that is actually in the not-for-profit sector. And so it complicates all of that enormously.
To know who's doing the measuring.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have one thing I wanted to share about it. And I know that this is about alternative responses, but we also know that, to have these alternatives, you need the police agency on board because, a lot of the calls are still coming in, at least in the traditional, the way most of these are unfolding, right? So they're coming in and it's like, okay, not police response, alternative response. And I just want to name a concern that I have, and that is, if we view all of these as alternatives, I'm concerned that efforts to train law enforcement in crisis intervention and their own alternative ways of interacting with people who may be experiencing crises is going to fall by the wayside. So we're focusing all on alternatives as if the only way that officers encounter people who are experiencing crises is through responding to calls for service. And that's just not true.
One of the things that interests me hugely as we've worked on alternative response is just to actually start to ask the question, what does policing look like? So if you imagine a world in which this becomes a big part of response, it raises questions about the part that people are moving away from. And so I think that's vital. I just want to underscore one other thing you said, and then either to hear back to you or Dr. Newstetter is at the mic. By tomorrow, we'll be Barry and Rebecca again. But
I thought she left the room. I'm like, uh-oh.
She was fed up with what she was hearing and she walked right out. You said something that's just been interesting to me about going back to the partners with the research. So we will have up on our website over the next couple of months the city reports that we've done. And one of the most gratifying things has been to take the research and get back on the phone with the infrastructure, the folks involved in the infrastructure, and have a conversation, which has not always been the norm.
Yeah.
Like, what did we learn?
Right.
What can we change?
Well, and I would say we can do even more than that as researchers, because, a lot of this is about evaluation, right? And we're trained as researchers to be objective as evaluators, to collect the data, to go off and then come back and say it worked or it didn't. And that's just it's not okay. And there's things called action research where you're actually measuring as you go. And so that you have this relationship where you're saying, I know you think that you're, diverting some share of calls for this reason, but actually when we look at the data, that's not the case. Here's ways you can improve it as you go. So, and I think you can still be an objective researcher and have that level of engagement so that you're not coming back a year or 2 years, and sometimes even 3 years later and saying, here's what we found. It didn't work because of X, Y, or Z. Why not have a real relationship where you can help improve it as you're evaluating it?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Levine, please. Just such important conversations, and as these programs grow, understanding what about them is working, what is it that we need to build upon, what is it that we need to change, is just such a critical part of building sustainable and scalable programs.